The summer of 1985 brought with it the kind of heat that settled over the small town of Pinehaven, like a weighted blanket. Nestled in the northern reaches of Minnesota, just 50 miles from the Canadian border, Pinehaven was the kind of place that appeared on maps only because cartographers had an obligation to document even the most forgettable corners of America. A single main street ran through it like a lifeline, flanked by weathered storefronts that had seen better days, their paint peeling under decades of harsh winters and unforgiving summers. The towering pines that gave the town its name stood sentinel around the perimeter, creating a natural barrier between civilization and the vast wilderness beyond. To outsiders, Pinehaven might have seemed picturesque, even idyllic, a vision of small-town America frozen in amber. But to the 1,000 or so residents who called it home, it was simply life, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the same families had occupied the same houses for generations, and where change came slowly, if at all. The centerpiece of Pinehaven was Lake Midnight, a sprawling body of water that stretched for miles just beyond the town's eastern edge. With depths reaching over 200 feet in certain places, the lake had always been an object of both reverence and fear for locals. Its waters were impossibly clear in the shallows, but faded to an impenetrable black as they deepened. Hence the name. Fishermen swore the lake held record-breaking catches, while parents warned their children of treacherous currents that could drag even the strongest swimmers to its murky bottom. By June of 1985, Lake Midnight had claimed 17 lives in the town's recorded history. By summer's end, that number would rise dramatically. On the morning of July 17, 1985, Scout Troop 47 assembled in the parking lot of the Pinehaven Community Church. 9 boys, aged 12 to 15, stood in their crisp uniforms, duffel bags at their feet, faces bright with anticipation. This was to be the highlight of their summer, a 5-day camping trip to Blackwater Island, a small, uninhabited island situated near the center of Lake Midnight. The island was a popular destination for the troop, having hosted countless camping trips over the decades without incident. Leading the expedition was Scoutmaster Thomas Grayling, a 36-year-old high school science teacher and lifelong Pinehaven resident. Grayling had been running Troop 47 for nearly a decade, taking over after the previous scoutmaster, his own father, passed away. He was well respected in the community, known for his strict adherence to scout protocols and his genuine dedication to the boys in his care. "Line up for equipment check," Grayling called out, consulting the clipboard in his hand. The 9 scouts formed a neat line, each stepping forward when their name was called. First was Adam Kelly, 15, the oldest of the group and serving as senior patrol leader. Quiet but confident, Adam had been planning this trip meticulously for months, earning his wilderness survival badge the previous summer. Next came Michael Thompson, also 15, Adam's best friend since kindergarten. Where Adam was reserved, Michael was boisterous, constantly cracking jokes and keeping spirits high. The Holt twins, Brian and Timothy, both 14, were inseparable as always. Known for finishing each other's sentences and sharing an almost telepathic bond, they had joined the Scouts just 2 years prior, but had quickly become integral members of the troop. Jason Reynolds, 14, stood apart from the others. New to town, having moved to Pinehaven just 6 months earlier from Minneapolis, he was still finding his place within the group. This trip would be his first major outing with troop. David Wilson, 13, clutched his inhaler in one hand, a nervous habit he'd developed since being diagnosed with asthma the previous year. Despite his condition, he had insisted on participating, not wanting to miss what everyone promised would be the adventure of a lifetime. Peter Mitchell, 13, shifted from foot to foot, unable to contain his excitement. The youngest son of the town's only doctor, Peter had grown up privileged but humble, and had found in the Scouts a place where his family's status meant nothing compared to his own merits. Benjamin Hayes, 12, was the youngest of the group, having just joined the troop earlier that year. Small for his age but fiercely determined, He had worked twice as hard as anyone else to earn his place on this trip. Last in line was Christopher Evans, 12, Benjamin's closest friend. The son of the local sheriff, Christopher had grown up hearing stories about Lake Midnight from his father, some wondrous, others warning. As Grayling completed his equipment check, another vehicle pulled into the parking lot, a forest green Jeep Cherokee, nearly new. From it emerged Ethan Miller, 24, Grayling's assistant scoutmaster, a former Eagle Scout himself. Miller had returned to Pinehaven after college, taking a job at the local hardware store and volunteering with the troop in his spare time. "Sorry I'm late," Miller called out, jogging over to the group. "Had to pick up some extra supplies." He held up a bag from the general store, which Grayling acknowledged with a nod. Parents lingered in the parking lot, helping to load gear into the 2 canoes and motorboat that would transport the group to Blackwater Island. Mothers hugged their sons, reminding them to apply sunscreen and stay hydrated. Fathers clapped shoulders, offering last-minute advice about fishing spots or the best places to pitch tents. By 9:30 a.m., everything was ready. The scouts, along with Grayling and Miller, posed for a group photograph before boarding their vessels. In the photo, which would later be reprinted in newspapers across the country, all 11 faces smiled back at the camera, unaware that this image would soon become synonymous with one of the most baffling disappearances in American history. The journey to Blackwater Island should have taken approximately 45 minutes. Grayling and 3 scouts took the motorboat, which also carried the bulk of their supplies. The remaining 6 boys split between the 2 canoes, with Miller supervising. The day was perfect for boating, clear skies, minimal wind, and the lake surface as smooth as glass. At 10:17 a.m., Grayling radioed back to shore, informing the ranger station that they had reached the island safely and were beginning to set up camp. This routine check-in would be the last communication anyone would have with troop. The plan was simple: 5 days of camping, hiking, fishing, and merit badge activities, with daily radio check-ins to the mainland. When the morning of July 22 came and went without word from the island, no one was immediately concerned. Radio batteries died, schedules slipped, these things happened. But when a second day passed without communication, Park Ranger William Foster decided to make the trip out to Blackwater Island himself. What he found, or rather what he didn't find, would spawn a mystery that would haunt Pinehaven for nearly 4 decades. Blackwater Island was completely deserted. The troops' tents were erected in a clearing, arranged in the standard scout formation around a central campfire pit. Some tents were open, sleeping bags neatly made inside. Others were zipped shut, as if their occupants had just stepped out momentarily. A pot of what appeared to be stew sat on a now cold portable camp stove. 9 sets of clothes hung from a makeshift clothesline strung between 2 pines, stiff with dried lake water. The motorboat and 1 canoe were secured at the island's small dock on the eastern shore. But the second canoe and all 11 members of Troop 47 had vanished without a trace. Foster's radio call to the Pinehaven Sheriff's Department at 11:42 a.m. on July 24, 1985, would trigger one of the most extensive search and rescue operations the state had ever seen. Within hours, the sleepy town of Pinehaven transformed into a hub of frantic activity. Sheriff Daniel Evans, father of missing Scout Christopher, established a command center at the town hall. State police arrived by mid-afternoon, followed closely by FBI agents from the Minneapolis field office. By nightfall, the first news vans had made the journey up from the Twin Cities, their satellite dishes a jarring sight against Pinehaven's rustic backdrop. The search began with a thorough combing of Blackwater Island itself. Every inch of the small landmass was examined for clues. Tracking dogs were brought in, picking up scents that led to the water's edge before disappearing. Divers explored the immediate perimeter of the island, but found nothing of note in the relatively shallow waters. As days turned into weeks, the search expanded. Helicopters swept the densest parts of the surrounding forest. Boats equipped with sonar scanned the deepest sections of Lake Midnight. Hundreds of volunteers walked in grid formations through miles of woodland, calling out names that echoed unanswered through the pines. The only tangible lead came 3 days into the search, when the missing canoe was discovered on the lake's northern shore, nearly 5 miles from Blackwater Island. The vessel was intact, overturned on a rocky beach with no signs of damage. Inside was a single item, a scout's compass, later identified as belonging to Adam Kelly. The compass was functional, its needle pointing steadily north, offering no hint as to how it came to be the canoe's lone occupant. The investigation quickly turned to the backgrounds of Scoutmaster Grayling and Assistant Scoutmaster Miller. Both men were subjected to intense scrutiny, their lives examined under the harsh light of suspicion. Thomas Grayling was a lifelong bachelor, a fact that raised eyebrows in the conservative community of 1985 Pinehaven. Neighbors described him as private but friendly, dedicated to his students and scouts. His small house on Elm Street was meticulously maintained, its interior lined with bookshelves filled with texts on astronomy, geology, and natural history. Nothing in his past suggested any capacity for violence or deception. His bank accounts showed no unusual activity. His phone records revealed no suspicious calls. Ethan Miller presented a somewhat more complex picture. After graduating from the University of Minnesota with a degree in environmental science, he had spent 2 years working for various outdoor education programs before returning to his hometown. Former colleagues described him as passionate and knowledgeable, if sometimes intense in his beliefs about conservation. One mentioned an incident where Miller had become uncharacteristically angry during a debate about logging rights near protected watersheds, though this was dismissed by others as simple passion for a cause he believed in. More intriguingly, Miller's Jeep Cherokee, left in the church parking lot during the camping trip, was found to contain a topographical map of Lake Midnight, with several locations marked in red ink. When questioned about this, Miller's parents explained that their son had been researching local indigenous archaeological sites as part of a personal project, something he'd been interested in since college. As the investigation progressed, a timeline of the troop's last known movements emerged. After arriving at the island around 10:15 a.m. on July 17, they had set up camp and apparently spent the afternoon on various scouting activities. A partially completed nature journal found in one of the tents suggested the boys had conducted a birdwatching expedition that first day. The camp's condition indicated they had prepared and likely eaten dinner on the evening of the 17th. The stew found in the pot was determined to be a beef and vegetable mixture, consistent with the meal plan found in Grayling's note. 9 dinner plates had been washed and stacked neatly near the campfire, suggesting the meal had been completed without disruption. Most of the boys' sleeping bags showed signs of use, with personal items like flashlights and books positioned as if their owners had settled in for the night. However, 2 tents, those belonging to Grayling and Miller, appeared unused, their sleeping bags still in their compression sacks. The most perplexing aspect of the scene was the lack of signs of struggle or panic. Nothing suggested a hasty departure or any form of distress. It was as if the 11 members of Troop 47 had simply walked away from their camp in an orderly fashion, leaving everything behind, including their shoes, which were found lined up outside each tent in standard scout protocol. By August 1985, the active search for Troop 47 had been scaled back, though not officially terminated. The FBI maintained that the case was likely a tragic accident. Perhaps the group had attempted a night hike or swim and encountered difficulties in the water. Without bodies, however, this theory remained speculative at best. Local theories were more varied and in some cases more fanciful. Some spoke of a family of bears or wolves, though wildlife experts pointed out that even a predator attack would have left evidence behind. Others suggested the boys might have stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see, perhaps a drug operation in the remote northern woods, and been silenced. The more supernaturally inclined residents whispered about the old legends surrounding Lake Midnight. Long before European settlers arrived, The area had been sacred to the indigenous Ojibwe people, who believed the lake to be a doorway between worlds. According to local law, the lake's unusual depth and clarity were the result of its connection to the spirit realm. The Ojibwe had warned the first white settlers not to build too close to its shores, advice that had been largely ignored in the town's founding. For the families of the missing, however, such theories offered little comfort. In the months that followed, several parents moved away from Pinehaven, unable to bear the constant reminders of their loss. Others stayed, becoming fixtures at the sheriff's office, demanding updates on an investigation that was yielding fewer leads with each passing day. Sheriff Evans, driven by both professional duty and personal anguish, continued to pursue the case long after the state and federal agencies had withdrawn their resources. His marriage crumbled under the weight of his obsession, his wife leaving town in early 1986, unable to watch her husband's slow descent into what she described in divorce papers as a pit of despair from which he refuses to climb out. By the first anniversary of the disappearance, Pinehaven had changed irrevocably. Tourism, once a modest but reliable income source for the town, had all but vanished. The camping grounds around Lake Midnight stood empty, their facilities falling into disrepair. The local economy suffered as outsiders, drawn by lurid news coverage, came not to spend money but to gawk at the sight of tragedy, taking photographs of grieving families and asking invasive questions. Thomas Grayling's elderly mother, who had initially defended her son vigorously against any implication of wrongdoing, passed away in December 1985, her health reportedly broken by the strain of the investigation and the thinly veiled accusations from neighbors she'd known for decades. Ethan Miller's parents fared somewhat better, retreating into a tight circle of supportive friends and family. They maintained their son's innocence until their deaths in a car accident in 1997, after which their house and all potential evidence it might have contained was lost to a fire of undetermined origin. As the years passed, the case of the missing scouts faded from national attention, becoming instead a macabre footnote in true crime anthologies and the occasional television special. In Pinehaven, however, it remained an open wound, a dividing line in the town's history. Before the disappearance and after, the lake itself became a place to be avoided rather than enjoyed. The town council, after much debate, eventually removed the dock from which Troop 47 had departed, and erected a memorial stone in its place. 9 small statues of scouts standing in formation, with 2 larger figures behind them. The memorial became a place of pilgrimage for the remaining families, though visits grew less frequent as decades passed. Sheriff Evans, who had never stopped investigating the case, was forced into retirement in 1998 after a minor stroke. He continued his work unofficially, converting his garage into what his neighbors referred to as the Crazy Wall. Hundreds of photographs, maps, notes, and newspaper clippings, connected by red string, a visual representation of a mystery he could neither solve nor surrender. By the early 2000s, most of the parents of the missing scouts had either passed away or left Pinehaven for good. The last to go was Michael Thompson's mother, Eleanor, who had become something of a local institution, maintaining a small museum dedicated to the missing boys in what had once been her son's bedroom. When she died in 2007, the contents of the museum were donated to the Pinehaven Historical Society, where they were relegated to a small corner display that few visitors bothered to examine. The case might have remained cold indefinitely, if not for a chance discovery in Jamie Foster, granddaughter of the now-deceased park ranger who had first discovered the abandoned campsite, was completing her master's degree in forensic anthropology at the University of Minnesota. For her thesis, she chose to re-examine the Troop 47 case using modern investigative techniques. Her research led her to archived evidence that had never been properly analyzed, including soil samples taken from the scouts' shoes found at the campsite. Using equipment not available in 1985, Foster discovered trace amounts of a mineral compound that was inconsistent with the known geology of Blackwater Island. The compound matched samples from only one location in the Lake Midnight area, an underwater cave system on the lake's western edge, over 3 miles from the island. Foster's findings, published in a criminology journal in 2020, reignited interest in the case. The Minnesota State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, responding to public pressure, formally reopened the investigation in early. The underwater cave system, known locally as the Devil's Pockets, had been mapped only partially in the decades since the disappearance. Parts of the network extended deep under the surrounding forest, with some passages believed to connect to dry caverns. The difficulty and danger of exploring these caves had prevented a thorough search in 1985, and subsequent expeditions had focused on other areas of the lake. In April 2021, a team of specialized cave divers began a systematic exploration of the Devil's Pockets. The operation was slow and methodical, with safety concerns limiting dives to just a few hours each day. For 3 years, they meticulously documented each branch and chamber, finding nothing directly connected to the missing scouts but gathering valuable data on the cave system's extent and layout. Then, in June 2024, almost exactly 39 years after the disappearance, the dive team made a discovery that would stun investigators and reignite national interest in the long-dormant case. In a previously unexplored chamber, approximately 160 feet below the surface and nearly a mile into the cave system, divers found what appeared to be a man-made stone structure. Unlike the natural limestone formations that dominated the caves, this structure was composed of carefully stacked granite blocks, forming a rough doorway that led to a small dry chamber beyond. Inside this chamber was a sight that left even the experienced dive team speechless. 9 scout uniforms, laid out in a perfect circle on the stone floor, each with its respective troop number and merit badges intact. In the center of the circle lay a scoutmaster's whistle, its silver surface untarnished, despite decades underwater, attached to a lanyard that bore the initials TG. There were no human remains, no bones or decomposed tissue, nothing to suggest the fate of the individuals who had once worn these uniforms. The clothes themselves were in an impossible state of preservation, showing none of the decay one would expect after nearly 4 decades submerged in lake water. Most disturbing of all was what the dive team found carved into the stone wall above the doorway. A single line of text, its letters crude but legible, etched into the rock with what forensic analysts would later determine was the blade of a scout's pocket knife. The message read, "We are not lost. We are exactly where we are supposed to be." The discovery sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and beyond. How had 11 people, 9 of them children, made their way to an underwater cave system over 3 miles from their campsite, apparently voluntarily and without leaving a trace of their journey? How had they accessed a chamber that had required modern diving equipment and years of careful exploration to reach? And most perplexingly, what had happened to their bodies? The uniforms were carefully retrieved and brought to the surface for analysis. Preliminary tests confounded experts. The fabric showed no signs of the bacterial decomposition that should have occurred in an underwater environment. There were no tears or damage that might indicate violence or struggle. Each uniform was clean, dry, and eerily well preserved, as if they had been placed there the day before rather than decades ago. DNA testing confirmed what was already suspected. These were indeed the uniforms of the 9 missing scouts, with traces of skin cells and hair that matched family reference samples kept in the case files. The whistle, too, was confirmed to be Scoutmaster Grayling's, the initials and serial number matching the one listed in his personal effects. But where were Thomas Grayling and Ethan Miller? And what had become of the 11 people who had apparently removed their clothes in an orderly fashion before vanishing completely? As news of the discovery spread, Pinehaven once again found itself at the center of a media frenzy. The town, which had shrunk to just over 600 residents in the intervening years, was ill-equipped to handle the influx of journalists, paranormal investigators, and morbidly curious tourists that descended upon it in the summer of. The few surviving relatives of the missing scouts were besieged with interview requests. Most declined to speak publicly, but Christopher Evans' older sister, now a grandmother in her 60s, gave a brief statement to a Minneapolis news station. "We have lived with this not knowing for nearly 40 years, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "Finding their uniforms doesn't bring closure. It only deepens the mystery. I don't know if we'll ever understand what happened to my brother and the others, but I hope these new developments might finally lead us to the truth, whatever that may be." Sheriff Daniel Evans, now 91 and residing in a nursing home outside Duluth, was informed of the discovery by his granddaughter. According to nursing staff, the retired lawman, whose mind had remained sharp despite his physical decline, listened to the news in silence before asking for pen and paper. He wrote just 7 words before closing his eyes and falling into a sleep from which he would not wake. "The lake has given back its dead." Evans passed away peacefully 3 days later. His decades-long vigil ended just as the case he had never abandoned appeared to be opening new chapters. As summer turned to fall in 2024, the investigation into the newly discovered evidence continued. The stone chamber was meticulously documented, with geologists and archaeologists joining the law enforcement team. Their findings raised more questions than answers. The granite used in the structure was not native to the region, with the closest matching source over 100 miles away in northern Wisconsin. The chamber itself appeared to have been constructed with techniques inconsistent with both modern methods and those that would have been available to the indigenous populations known to have inhabited the area historically. Most bizarrely, the scientists could find no evidence of how the chamber had been built underwater, or how it had maintained a pocket of air when discovered. The physics simply didn't add up yet. The chamber existed, a physical impossibility housing the only concrete evidence found in a case that had confounded investigators for nearly 4 decades. As winter approached and the lake's surface began to freeze, access to the dive site became increasingly challenging. The investigation was temporarily suspended, scheduled to resume in spring. The uniforms and other evidence were transferred to the FBI's laboratory in Quantico, Virginia for more advanced analysis. And in Pinehaven, the town that had never fully recovered from the wounds of 1985, residents prepared for another long winter of unanswered questions. The memorial stone by the former dock gathered frost, 9 small figures and 2 larger ones standing eternal watch over the waters of Lake Midnight, waters that had finally, after 39 years, begun to give up their secrets. What those secrets would ultimately reveal, and whether they would bring closure to one of America's most enduring mysteries, remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. The case of Troop 47 was far from over. In fact, it seemed that the true story was only just beginning to emerge from the depths. Spring came late to Pinehaven in 2025. Ice clung stubbornly to Lake Midnight's surface well into April, delaying the resumption of the investigation. The town itself remained caught in a strange limbo, torn between the desire for resolution and the fear of what further discoveries might reveal. Tourism had surged in the wake of the underwater chamber's discovery, bringing a much-needed economic boost, but also reopening wounds that had never fully healed. The Pinehaven Motel, a modest 12-room establishment that had barely survived the post-disappearance decline, now displayed a perpetual no-vacancy sign. Its parking lot filled with rental cars bearing license plates from across the country. The diner on Main Street extended its hours to accommodate the influx of visitors, serving mystery specials and Scouts Honor burgers to customers who pored over printouts of news articles and amateur maps of the lake. Not everyone in town appreciated this macabre renaissance. Several longtime residents, including relatives of the missing, had placed no trespassing signs on their properties after finding strangers taking photographs of their homes or attempting to conduct impromptu interviews. The local newspaper, the Pinehaven Gazette, ran an editorial condemning what it called tragedy tourism and urging visitors to respect the community's privacy. Against this backdrop, The official investigation quietly resumed when the lake thawed in late April. The team had expanded significantly, now including experts from various federal agencies, academic institutions, and even a representative from NASA's Underwater Archaeology Division, who had been brought in to consult on the unusual preservation of the uniforms. Dr. Emily Hartwick, the NASA specialist, established a temporary laboratory in the former ranger station overlooking the lake. A stoic woman in her 50s with a reputation for solving the unsolvable. Hartwick had requested involvement in the case after reading Jamie Foster's reports on the chamber's anomalous properties. What we are dealing with here defies conventional understanding of material degradation in underwater environments, Hartwick explained during a closed briefing with the investigation team. Fabric immersed in water, even cold. Fresh water with minimal biological activity should show significant decomposition after nearly 4 decades. These uniforms show none. It's as if they were placed in that chamber yesterday. Her preliminary findings on the stone chamber were equally puzzling. Analysis of water samples taken from inside the air pocket revealed an unusual chemical composition, with oxygen levels nearly twice what would be expected in a natural cave environment. The stone itself, while visually resembling granite, contained mineral compounds that didn't match any known quarry source in North America. Whatever this chamber is, Hartwick concluded, it wasn't built using materials or methods that conform to our current scientific understanding. While Hartwick's team focused on the physical evidence, another branch of the investigation was exploring the human element of the mystery. FBI Special Agent Lucille Vasquez had been assigned to re-examine the backgrounds and connections of everyone involved with Troop, a 20-year veteran of the Bureau with a specialty in cold cases. Vasquez approached the investigation with methodical precision, starting with the families of the missing. Most of the parents were now deceased, but siblings, cousins, and in some cases children who had never known their missing fathers provided DNA samples and family histories. Vasquez was particularly interested in any patterns or connections that might have been overlooked in the original investigation, shared interests, conflicts, or unusual behaviors in the days leading up to the camping trip. One such connection emerged through interviews with Timothy Holt's younger sister, Grace, now in her 50s. According to Grace, her brothers Brian and Timothy had become unusually interested in Ojibwe legends in the months before their disappearance. They had spent hours at the local library researching indigenous history and had even attempted to contact elders from the reservation 70 miles north of Pinehaven. They were obsessed with stories about the lake, Grace recalled during her interview, especially one about a place called the Pathway Between Stars. They said it was some kind of doorway that only appeared during certain celestial alignments. I thought it was just another one of their shared fascinations. They were always getting caught up in some new interest together. Similar accounts emerged from other families. Peter Mitchell had reportedly been keeping a journal of lake observations for months before the trip, meticulously recording water levels, temperature changes, and unusual phenomena like unexplained lights or sounds. The journal had never been found among his belongings at the campsite. Jason Reynolds, the newcomer to the group, had allegedly confided in his mother about strange dreams involving lake midnight dreams that had begun almost immediately after the family's move to Pinehaven. In one particularly vivid dream, he had described standing on the shore while the lake's water parted like a curtain, revealing a stone pathway leading downward. These accounts might have been dismissed as coincidental if not for what Vasquez discovered in Thomas Grayling's personal effects. Among the items recovered from his house in 1985 was a collection of astronomical charts and calculations, many focused on planetary alignments occurring in July. Margin notes, written in Grayling's precise handwriting, made repeated reference to something called the convergence, and included a countdown to what appeared to be July 17, the day the troop departed for Blackwater Island. Even more intriguing was a letter found in Ethan Miller's college records, sent to a professor of anthropology at the University of Minnesota. In it, Miller described finding a potentially significant archaeological site near Lake Midnight and requested guidance on proper documentation procedures. The professor's response, also in the file, gently suggested that what Miller had described sounded more like a natural formation than a man-made structure, and recommended several texts on distinguishing between the two. The professor, now emeritus and in his 80s, had no recollection of Miller when contacted by Vasquez. He did, however, remember receiving quite a few inquiries about that lake in the early 1980s, suggesting Miller wasn't the only one interested in potential archaeological finds in the area. These threads, astronomical calculations, indigenous legends, underwater structures began to weave together into a pattern that was as compelling as it was perplexing. Was it possible that the disappearance of Troop 47 had been not a tragedy but a planned event? Had Grayling and Miller deliberately led the boys to the underwater chamber for some purpose connected to their shared research? If so, the question remained, where were their bodies, and what was the significance of the uniforms left behind in that impossible circle? While the federal investigation pursued these questions, local law enforcement was dealing with a more immediate concern. Since the discovery of the underwater chamber, Lake Midnight had seen a sharp increase in unauthorized diving attempts. Despite the dangers clearly communicated by authorities, cold water, complex cave systems, limited visibility, thrill seekers and amateur investigators were regularly caught attempting to reach the site of the discovery. In late May 2025, one such attempt ended in tragedy when two YouTubers from California drowned after venturing into the cave system without proper equipment or training. Their bodies were recovered from an area approximately halfway between the lake's surface and the chamber, their helmet-mounted cameras containing their final moments as they became disoriented in the labyrinthine passages. The incident led to increased security around the lake and a temporary suspension of all diving operations, even for the official investigation team. This pause gave researchers time to consolidate their findings and develop new theories about what might have happened to Troop. Dr. Alan Weber, a forensic psychologist consulting on the case, proposed what he called the collective fugue state theory. According to Weber, it was possible that some environmental factor, perhaps a naturally occurring gas release from the lake bottom, or a rare fungal contaminant in their food, had induced a shared hallucinatory experience among the group. Under this influence, they might have collectively removed their uniforms and ventured into the water, eventually drowning. The unusual arrangement of the uniforms and the carved message suggest ritualistic behavior consistent with shared delusion. Weber argued, the lack of bodies could be explained by lake currents carrying them to deeper areas that haven't yet been explored. The theory had its merits, but failed to explain several key aspects of the case. How the group had navigated to a specific underwater location 3 miles from their campsite, how they had apparently constructed or accessed the stone chamber, and perhaps most problematically, why no traces of 11 bodies had ever been found in the lake, despite nearly 4 decades of intermittent searches. Another theory came from Dr. Hartwick's team, who had been analyzing the mineral composition of both the chamber and the lake bed around it. Their findings suggested that the entire area had experienced some form of localized geological event in the past, possibly a sudden release of gas or energy from deep within the Earth's crust. Such an event, they proposed, could have created temporary conditions that allowed for the rapid creation of mineral structures that would normally take thousands of years to form. We are essentially looking at a geological impossibility, Hartwick explained. This chamber shouldn't exist, at least not formed through any process we currently understand. The only comparable formations we have seen are in deep-sea hydrothermal vent fields, where extreme conditions create rapid mineral precipitation. But those occur at depths and pressures far beyond what's present in Lake Midnight. The investigation was further complicated by what appeared to be deliberate obfuscation in the historical record. Journalist Rebecca Donovan, who had been covering the case for a national news magazine, discovered that several key documents related to Lake Midnight's early surveying had been removed from the Minnesota State Archives sometime in the late 90s. The missing records included the original depth soundings conducted in 1912 and a geological survey from 1934. that had reportedly contained anomalous findings regarding the lake's formation. Similarly, researchers trying to corroborate the Ojibwe legends about the lake found that many of the elders who might have had direct knowledge had either passed away or were reluctant to discuss the matter with outsiders. Those who did speak mentioned a traditional prohibition against sharing certain stories about the lake with non-Indigenous people, particularly regarding the pathway between stars that the Holt twins had been researching. By early June 2025, public interest in the case had begun to wane as the investigation appeared to stall. The initial media frenzy had subsided, television crews packing up their equipment and moving on to fresher stories. In Pinehaven, the brief economic boom faded, leaving the town once again to face its ghosts in relative isolation. Then on June 17, 2025, almost exactly 40 years after the disappearance and 1 year after the underwater chamber's discovery, the case took an unexpected turn. Lucas Hayes, nephew of the missing scout Benjamin Hayes and now a forest ranger in northern Wisconsin, was clearing out his recently deceased father's attic when he came across a locked metal box. Inside was a collection of items his father had apparently kept hidden for decades. Newspaper clippings about the disappearance, a worn photograph of Benjamin, and most significantly, a cassette tape labeled Tommy's Last Call, July 6. The tape contained a recorded phone conversation between Thomas Grayling and Lucas's father, William Hayes, made the night before the camping trip. The recording was scratchy and incomplete, with several sections too degraded to understand, but certain phrases stood out with chilling clarity. "It's happening tomorrow, Bill," Grayling's voice said. "The alignments are perfect and I have confirmed the location. This is what we have been waiting for." William Hayes sounded hesitant. "Are you sure about this, Tommy? These are just kids we are talking about. Your calculations could be off." "They are not off," Grayling replied firmly. "And the boys are ready, more ready than you know. They have been preparing for months. This isn't a camping trip, Bill. It's an expedition to somewhere else." The conversation continued with references to the passage, the other side, and most disturbingly, permanent transition. At one point, Grayling assured Hayes that Benjamin was special and had been chosen for a reason. The recording ended abruptly after Grayling said, "Once we cross over, there's no coming back. You need to accept that. We all do." Lucas Hayes turned the tape over to the FBI immediately. Forensic audio analysts confirmed its authenticity, though they noted it appeared to have been edited at some point, with portions potentially removed or rearranged. William Hayes, who had passed away from cancer 3 months earlier, had never mentioned the recording to anyone, not during the original investigation, not in the decades of public speculation that followed, and not even to his own family. The recording cast the case in an entirely new light. Far from a tragic accident or even a planned disappearance, it now appeared that Grayling had deliberately led the scouts to some predetermined location, with the expectation of a permanent transition, a phrase that carried ominous connotations. Was this evidence of a mass suicide, a cult-like indoctrination, or something even more inexplicable? Special Agent Vasquez ordered a complete re-examination of all surviving physical evidence, focusing particularly on any astronomical or geographical references that might help identify the location Grayling mentioned. Hartwick's team resumed their analysis of the underwater chamber, this time with specific attention to any features that could be interpreted as a passage or doorway. Meanwhile, another piece of the puzzle emerged from an unexpected source. Catherine Thompson, Michael Thompson's niece and a librarian at the University of Minnesota, had been conducting her own research into her uncle's disappearance. In the university's archives, she discovered a collection of papers donated by a former professor of astronomy who had died in 1989. Among them was a handwritten letter from Ethan Miller, dated May 1985, requesting information about a specific celestial alignment occurring in mid-July of that year. The professor's notes on the letter indicated that he had provided Miller with the requested information, along with a warning about fringe interpretations of astronomical events. More tellingly, he had written a draft response apparently never sent in which he expressed concern about Miller's interest in thoroughly debunked theories regarding stellar gateways, and his references to Lake Midnight as a potential thin place. The term thin place, Catherine explained to investigators, originated in Celtic mythology to describe locations where the boundary between the physical world and some other realm was believed to be more permeable. Similar concepts existed in various cultures around the world, including in certain Ojibwe traditions that specifically identified deep bodies of water as potential crossing points. As these new details came to light, the dive team finally received clearance to resume their exploration of the underwater chamber in late June. Their mission now had a more specific focus: to determine whether the chamber contained any feature that could be interpreted as a passage or doorway beyond the entrance they had already documented. The first dive revealed nothing new. The chamber remained as it had been found a year earlier, an impossibly preserved space with the 9 uniforms arranged in their perfect circle, the carved message still clearly visible above the entrance. The team conducted a thorough scan of the walls using ground-penetrating radar, looking for any hidden compartments or passages, but found nothing beyond the natural limestone formations. It was on the third day of renewed exploration, July 2, 2025, that diver Matteo Russo noticed something unusual about the chamber's floor. While the walls were rough limestone, the floor appeared to be a single slab of the same granite-like material used in the entrance construction. Moreover, at the exact center of the uniform circle where Grayling's whistle had been found, there was a slight depression, almost like a keyhole. The discovery prompted a new line of investigation. What if the chamber itself wasn't the destination Grayling had referred to, but merely an antechamber or preparation room for whatever lay beyond? What if the arranged uniforms and the whistle were components of some ritual or mechanism intended to activate the true passage? Dr. Hartwick, intrigued by this possibility, requested permission to conduct a more invasive examination of the chamber floor. After much debate among the various agencies involved, approval was granted for a small core sample to be taken from the central depression. The sample, extracted on July 9, 2025, defied all expectations. Instead of solid stone, the core revealed a column of what appeared to be liquid mercury, somehow contained within the rock without any visible barrier or container. More bizarrely, the mercury exhibited properties inconsistent with its normal behavior. It remained perfectly stable despite the disturbance of the drilling, neither flowing out nor evaporating, as expected. Laboratory analysis of the mercury revealed yet another anomaly. It contained isotopic ratios, unlike any naturally occurring mercury on Earth. According to Dr. Hartwick, the only comparable samples ever recorded came from meteorites, suggesting an extraterrestrial origin. We are dealing with something completely outside our scientific framework, Hartwick admitted during an emergency briefing. This material shouldn't exist in this form, in this location, or with these properties. The fact that it does forces us to consider explanations that would normally be dismissed as fringe science at best. The discovery of the anomalous mercury prompted a re-evaluation of the astronomical data Grayling had been studying before the disappearance. Dr. Leonard Kwan, an astrophysicist brought in to consult on the case, identified a rare planetary alignment that had occurred on the night of July 1985, one that would have placed several planets in direct alignment with a specific star in the Pleiades cluster, when viewed from the precise coordinates of Lake Midnight. This type of alignment occurs approximately once every 440 years, Kwan explained. What makes it particularly interesting is that the indigenous name for the Pleiades translates roughly to the pathway stars or the doorway in the sky, depending on the dialect. The connection to the pathway between stars that had fascinated the Holt twins was unmistakable. Had Grayling and Miller somehow discovered an ancient knowledge about Lake Midnight's connection to this celestial alignment? Had they deliberately timed their expedition to coincide with a cosmic event that occurred only once every few centuries? If so, what exactly had they expected to happen? And had it occurred as anticipated? As July 17, 2025, the 40th anniversary of the disappearance approached, tension in Pinehaven reached a fever pitch. The town council, after heated debate, voted to hold a memorial service at the lakeside monument, inviting surviving family members and the public to attend. Meanwhile, law enforcement established a security perimeter around the lake, determined to prevent any unauthorized access during what many feared might be an attempt to recreate whatever had occurred 4 decades earlier. The night before the anniversary, Dr. Hartwick's team made a final dive to the chamber, installing monitoring equipment to record any changes or anomalies that might occur during the anniversary. As a precaution, they also retrieved the core of liquid mercury, sealing it in a specially designed container for further study on the surface. What no one anticipated was that removing the mercury would trigger a reaction within the chamber itself. At precisely 3:42 a.m. on July 17, 2025, the monitoring equipment detected a sudden drop in water pressure throughout the cave system. Underwater cameras showed the impossible. The water inside the chamber was receding, draining away through previously invisible seams in the floor despite the enormous pressure of the lake above. Within minutes, the entire chamber was dry, a bubble of air surrounded by millions of gallons of water that somehow held back as if restrained by an invisible barrier. The phenomenon lasted exactly 17 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, water rushed back into the chamber with such force that several pieces of monitoring equipment were destroyed. When dive teams returned hours later to assess the damage, they found the chamber transformed. The uniforms were gone. The carved message above the doorway had changed, now reading, "The door opens both ways." And there, in the center of the now empty floor, lay a single object that had not been present before, a modern digital watch, its face cracked but its LCD display still functioning, showing the date as July 17, 2025, and the time as 3:59 a.m., the exact moment when water had returned to the chamber. The serial number on the watch's back matched one purchased 6 months earlier by Matteo Russo, the diver who had first noticed the depression in the chamber floor. Russo, who had not been part of the dive team that night, and whose watch had reportedly been on his wrist at home when the anomaly occurred, had no explanation for its appearance in the chamber. Most disturbing of all was what security footage from Russo's apartment building revealed. At precisely 3:42 a.m., while the chamber was draining, Russo had walked out of his building in what appeared to be a sleepwalking state. Cameras tracked him walking exactly 17 blocks before stopping abruptly at 3:59 a.m., the moment water returned to the chamber and collapsing to the ground. Unconscious but unharmed, when questioned after recovering in the hospital, Russo had no memory of leaving his apartment. He did, however, report a vivid dream in which he had been standing in a circle with 9 boys and a man he didn't recognize, all wearing scout uniforms. In the dream, the man had pointed to a doorway made of light and said, "It's time to go home." The FBI, now treating the case as a potential national security matter, established a permanent research station at Lake Midnight. The underwater chamber was declared off-limits to all personnel pending further assessment of the risks involved. In a closed congressional briefing, Dr. Hartwick presented her team's findings and their disturbing implications. "We are facing the possibility," she concluded, "that what happened to Troop 47 in 1985 was not a conventional disappearance at all, but something far more profound, a transition between states of reality that our current scientific understanding simply cannot account for." She paused, looking around at the skeptical faces before her, then added, "And based on recent events, we must consider the possibility that this transition was not a one-way journey." Back in Pinehaven, as summer faded into autumn once more, residents reported an increasing frequency of strange phenomena around the lake. Unexplained lights beneath the water's surface, electronic devices malfunctioning in specific locations, and most unsettlingly, dreams shared by dozens of unconnected individuals of 9 boys and 2 men walking out of the lake, still wearing their scout uniforms, their faces obscured by a strange light as they moved in perfect formation toward the town. Whether these were mass hysteria, the result of heightened suggestion after recent events, or something more tangible remained to be determined. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear to those involved in the investigation. The disappearance of Troop 47 had never been about death or tragedy. It had been about transformation and return. As October 2025 drew to a close, security cameras at the Lakeside Memorial captured a brief but clear image of a young boy in a scout uniform standing motionless before the stone monuments. The footage, though grainy, showed enough detail for facial recognition software to identify the figure with 98.7% certainty as Benjamin Hayes. Not as he would appear now, in his 50s, but exactly as he had looked down to the small scar above his right eyebrow from a biking accident 3 months before he disappeared. The boy looked directly at the camera for several seconds before turning toward the lake. As he walked toward the water's edge, the footage abruptly ended, not due to technical failure, but because the camera itself had been found the next morning, perfectly intact with its memory card missing. In its place was a small compass, its needle pointing not north, but directly toward the center of Lake Midnight, where something was stirring in the depths, preparing to emerge. The appearance of what seemed to be Benjamin Hayes at the Lakeside Memorial transformed the investigation from a scientific curiosity to a matter of urgent national security. Within hours of the footage being discovered, Lake Midnight was declared a restricted zone, with military personnel establishing checkpoints on all access roads and a no-fly zone enforced over the entire area. The town of Pinehaven found itself under a form of soft quarantine. Residents could come and go, but only after thorough identification checks. Visitors were turned away entirely unless they could prove essential business in the area. Satellite news vans that had begun to reappear were escorted beyond the town limits. Their crews informed that broadcasting restrictions were now in place under a rarely invoked national security directive. Behind this sudden clampdown lay a truth that authorities were desperate to contain. Benjamin Hayes was not the only one who had been seen. In the 72 hours following the memorial incident, reports flooded the local sheriff's office of scout-uniformed figures, observed throughout the area, walking down Main Street in perfect formation, standing motionless at the edge of residents' properties, and most frequently emerging from the waters of Lake Midnight before dawn, their clothes somehow dry, their faces obscured by what witnesses described as a light that came from within. Each sighting lasted only moments, the figures vanishing when directly approached or when any attempt was made to photograph or film them. The single exception was the memorial footage, which experts had now analyzed frame by frame, confirming that the boy in the image was physically present rather than a digital artifact or manipulation. Dr. Emily Hardwick, whose temporary laboratory had been expanded into a full research facility under joint NASA and Department of Defense oversight, proposed a theory that was as elegant as it was disturbing. What they were witnessing was not the return of troops, but rather a form of temporal echo moments from 1985 bleeding into 2025, as the barrier between these time periods weakened around the anniversary of the disappearance. "Think of time as a fabric," she explained to the assembled team of scientists and government officials. "Under normal circumstances, it's tightly woven, with each thread, each moment distinct and separate from the others. But certain events can create tears or thin spots in this fabric. What happened 40 years ago with Troop 47 appears to have created such a tear, and now we are seeing moments from then slipping through into our now." Not everyone was convinced. Special Agent Vasquez, who had been tracking each reported sighting and mapping them across Pinehaven, had noticed a pattern that contradicted the echo hypothesis. The appearances weren't random or repetitive. They formed a deliberate progression, moving in concentric circles inward from the lake's edge toward the center of town. "These aren't echoes," Vasquez argued. "They are reconnaissance. Whatever these figures are, they are mapping the town, learning its layout, preparing for something more substantial than these brief appearances." The debate became moot on November 2. Eleanor Wilson, the 78-year-old grandmother of David Wilson, the scout who had carried an inhaler, was alone in her home on Pinehaven's western edge when she heard a knock at her door. Opening it, she found herself face to face with her grandson, not as he would be now in his 50s, but as the 13-year-old boy who had disappeared 4 decades earlier. According to Eleanor's statement, the boy looked at her with recognition, smiled and said simply, "Grandma, we are almost ready to come back, but there's a problem with the door. It doesn't want to stay open." When Eleanor, overcome with emotion, reached out to touch him, her hand passed through the boy as if he were made of smoke. His form rippled momentarily before stabilizing again. "Don't be afraid," the boy continued, his voice sounding distant despite his apparent proximity. "We need help from this side. The others are working from our side, but the door needs to be opened from both directions at once." Before Eleanor could ask any of the dozens of questions racing through her mind, the boy looked over his shoulder as if hearing something she couldn't, then turned back with an expression of urgency. "Find Thomas's notes. Find the alignment. 40 years is the key." With that, the figure dissipated entirely, leaving Eleanor alone on her doorstep with nothing but the cold November air and a faint scent of pine that had been her grandson's favorite camping soap. Eleanor immediately reported the encounter to authorities, who might have dismissed it as the hallucination of an elderly woman, were it not for her security system. The camera mounted above her front door had captured the entire interaction, complete with audio that matched her account perfectly. Most striking was the moment her hand passed through the boy's form, causing a visual distortion that tech analysts described as similar to passing a magnet over an old television screen. The instruction to find Thomas's notes triggered a renewed examination of Thomas Grayling's personal effects. The original investigation in 1985 had catalogued and preserved everything from his home, but certain items, including a leather-bound journal referenced in multiple inventory lists, had somehow gone missing from the evidence storage sometime in the early 90s. A search of county records revealed that Grayling's house, which had stood vacant for years after his disappearance, had been purchased in 1992 by a foundation called the Midnight Research Collective. Further investigation showed the collective had been established by a group of anonymous donors with the stated purpose of investigating anomalous phenomena in the Lake Midnight region. The foundation had dissolved in 2001, and the house had passed through several owners since, currently serving as a vacation rental. A warranted search of the property revealed nothing of interest, until agents noticed that the dimensions of the interior rooms didn't quite match the exterior measurements of the house. Behind a carefully concealed panel in the basement, they discovered a small room that had been sealed off for decades. Inside was a metal filing cabinet containing hundreds of documents, most significantly the missing journal, and a set of astronomical charts, far more detailed than those previously recovered. The journal's entries, dating back to 1978, documented Grayling's growing obsession with Lake Midnight and its connection to celestial events. Early entries described vivid dreams of a city beneath the water and people who are not people, waiting to make contact. As the years progressed, the writing became more focused, with Grayling describing his recruitment of Ethan Miller and their joint research into what he called the 40-year cycle. According to Grayling's calculations, Lake Midnight experienced a thinning of reality every 40 years, coinciding with specific astronomical alignments. During these periods, which lasted approximately 1 lunar cycle, it became possible to transition between our world and somewhere else, a place he described alternately as the other side, the beneath, and most frequently home. Most disturbing were the entries from early 1985, in which Grayling detailed his careful selection of the 9 scouts who would accompany them. Each boy had been chosen for specific qualities: Adam Kelly for his leadership, the Holt twins for their natural sensitivity to the beyond, Jason Reynolds because he had already been touched by them in dreams, and so on for each member of the troop. The final entry, dated July 16, 1985, The night before the camping trip contained just 3 sentences. All preparations are complete. The boys are ready, though they don't fully understand what awaits us. By this time tomorrow we will have left this world behind for the better one that has been calling us home. The astronomical charts found with the journal were even more revealing. They mapped not only the July 1985 alignment that had coincided with the troops' disappearance, but also predicted an identical alignment occurring in late November 2025, exactly 40 years after the first, just as the apparition of David Wilson had indicated. Dr. Kwan, after analyzing the charts, confirmed their accuracy with visible amazement. Grayling's calculations are incredibly sophisticated, especially for someone working without modern computing tools in the early 90s. He correctly identified a complex celestial alignment involving not just the visible planets but also specific stars in the Pleiades cluster. According to his charts, this alignment will reach its perfect position on November 17. What Grayling had called the 40-year cycle appeared to be a genuine astronomical phenomenon, one that would bring the exact configuration of celestial bodies into alignment over Lake Midnight for the first time since Troop 47 had vanished. The implications were clear. Whatever doorway had opened in 1985, allowing 11 people to disappear from our reality, was preparing to open again. The question that divided the research team was whether they should attempt to close this doorway permanently, preventing whatever might be trying to come through, or assist in opening it, potentially allowing the missing scouts and their leaders to return. For the families of the missing, there was no debate. When informed about the situation after signing extensive non-disclosure agreements, they unanimously supported efforts to bring their loved ones home. For the military and intelligence officials now overseeing the operation, the decision was more complicated, balancing the humanitarian desire for reunion against the unknown risks of opening a portal to somewhere beyond our reality. In the end, a compromise was reached. The team would work to understand the mechanism of the door with the goal of controlled, temporary access, enough to potentially retrieve the missing troop members, but not so much as to create a permanent breach between worlds. With the November 17 alignment rapidly approaching, Dr. Hartwick's team focused on replicating the conditions of the underwater chamber as it had existed before the mercury core was removed. Meanwhile, Special Agent Vasquez coordinated with local authorities to monitor for additional appearances of the scout figures, hoping to establish communication and gather more information about the conditions on the other side. One crucial piece of information came from an unexpected source. Lucas Hayes, who had discovered the recorded phone call between his father and Grayling, came forward with another family secret. His father had been present at Lake Midnight on the night Troop 47 disappeared. According to a deathbed confession William Hayes had made to his son, he had followed the troop to Blackwater Island, arriving after dark and observing from a distance as Grayling led the boys in what appeared to be some kind of ritual on the shore. Hayes had watched as the entire group walked into the lake together, fully clothed, and disappeared beneath the surface, not struggling or drowning, but walking deliberately downward, as if descending an invisible staircase. Most remarkably, Hayes claimed to have seen the water around them glow with an internal light, creating what he described as a pathway of stars leading into the depths. Too frightened to follow and unwilling to report what he had seen for fear of being dismissed as insane, Hayes had returned to shore and kept his knowledge secret for 40 years, removing certain evidence from the investigation whenever possible to protect his son's memory from what he viewed as a taint of the supernatural. With this new information, the research team began to develop a theory about what had actually happened to Troop 47. The scouts hadn't drowned or been abducted in any conventional sense. They had knowingly and willingly walked into another reality, led there by Grayling and Miller, who had somehow discovered the means to open a portal during the 1985 alignment. The uniforms left behind in the underwater chamber were not evidence of their deaths, but rather of their transition, ceremonial objects left as markers or perhaps as anchors to their original world. The carved message, "We are not lost. We are exactly where we are supposed to be," was not a cry for help but a reassurance to anyone who might come looking for them. And now, 40 years later, they were trying to return. But why? If they had gone willingly to a better world, as Grayling had written, what would compel them to come back 4 decades later? The answer came on November 10, just a week before the alignment would reach its peak. Dr. Hartwick, who had been working with a team to recreate the conditions of the chamber using the recovered mercury sample, collapsed suddenly during an experiment. When she regained consciousness hours later, she claimed to have experienced a vision or mental contact with someone on the other side. It wasn't paradise they found, she reported, her voice hoarse, eyes wide with lingering shock. It was a prison, a trap designed to look like what they most desired. They have been trying to escape for 40 years, but the door only opens from both sides simultaneously. They need our help to get back. When asked who had communicated this to her, Hartwick's response was unsettling, all of them speaking with one voice. They are connected somehow, unified in a way I can't fully explain. But they are still themselves, still human, and they want to come home. Further experiments confirmed that proximity to the recovered mercury sample created a weak point in reality, a potential communication channel with the other side. Using this channel, the research team established intermittent contact with what appeared to be a collective consciousness representing Troop 47. The story that emerged was both fascinating and horrifying. According to their account, the scouts and their leaders had indeed discovered another world beyond the underwater portal, a place that initially appeared to be everything Grayling had promised, a pristine wilderness untouched by human corruption, where the natural laws worked slightly differently, allowing for what seemed like magical phenomena. Only gradually did they realize they were not alone in this realm. The entities that had lured them there, the same ones that had been communicating with Grayling through his dreams for years, had disguised their true nature and purpose. They were ancient beings who could not physically enter our reality without a host, and they had carefully orchestrated the scouts' transition as a means of eventual invasion. For 40 years, the trapped humans had resisted assimilation, maintaining their separate identities through sheer force of will, while searching for a way back. They had discovered that the portal could be reopened during the 40-year alignment, but only if the precise conditions were recreated on both sides simultaneously. Now, with the alignment approaching, they had a plan, but it required cooperation from our side, specifically a recreation of the original portal configuration with the mercury core replaced and the chamber restored to its original state. The risk was obvious. Opening the portal might allow not only the scouts to return, but also the entities that had imprisoned them. The military contingent advocated for abandoning the rescue attempt entirely, arguing that the potential threat to national security, perhaps global security, was too great. The families, however, were unanimous in their determination to bring their loved ones home. And as November 17 drew closer, public pressure mounted as well, despite the information blackout. Somehow, rumors of the scouts' possible return had leaked into the town, and a grassroots movement had formed, with residents placing 11 candles in their windows each night, a silent vigil for those who had been lost and might now be found. In a tense meeting on November 15, just 2 days before the alignment, the decision was made to proceed with the rescue attempt, but with significant military contingencies in place. Lake Midnight would be surrounded by armed forces prepared to neutralize any threat that emerged from the portal. The underwater chamber would be rigged with explosives that could be remotely detonated if necessary, sealing the passage permanently. And most controversially, each returning scout would be subject to immediate quarantine and examination to ensure they had not been compromised by the entities from the other side. The night of November 17, 2025 was clear and cold, the stars unusually bright over Lake Midnight. The research team, led by Hartwick, had successfully replaced the mercury core in the chamber's floor and restored the arrangement of uniforms based on detailed photographs from the original discovery. Above the surface, family members of the missing gathered at the shore, older siblings now in their 70s, nieces and nephews who had grown up with the story of their lost relatives, and in a few cases, elderly parents who had held on to hope for 40 years. Military personnel maintained a discreet perimeter, their weapons concealed but ready. Medical teams stood by with equipment for both emergency treatment and containment. Everyone wore communication devices linked to a central command post where Special Agent Vasquez and her team monitored the operation. At precisely 11:42 p.m., the moment Grayling's charts had predicted for perfect alignment, the surface of Lake Midnight began to shimmer with an internal light, just as William Hayes had described witnessing 4 decades earlier. The light seemed to emanate from the depths, creating a vertical column that extended from the location of the underwater chamber up through the water and into the night sky, where it appeared to connect directly with the Pleiades star cluster, now positioned directly overhead. Monitoring equipment inside the chamber registered a sudden pressure change as water began to recede, creating the same air pocket that had been observed during the July event. Underwater cameras showed the uniforms starting to glow, each emitting a pale blue light that increased in intensity until they appeared to dissolve entirely, leaving behind human-shaped outlines of pure luminescence. The mercury core, now fully exposed in the center of the floor, began to pulse rhythmically, each beat sending a wave of energy through the chamber that registered on instruments as an unknown form of radiation. The carved message above the doorway changed once again, the stone itself seeming to flow like liquid before resolidifying with new words. "The door is open. We are coming home." At the surface, the column of light widened, creating what appeared to be a pathway extending down into the depths, a staircase made of light, leading directly to the underwater chamber, nearly 200 feet below. The water around this pathway remained perfectly still, unaffected by the laws of physics that should have caused it to collapse inward. For several minutes, nothing happened. The pathway remained open, the chamber below pulsing with energy, but no figures emerged from either. Tension mounted among the observers on shore, with military personnel moving into position for what some feared would be a hostile emergence. Then, at exactly midnight, a single figure appeared at the bottom of the light staircase, visible through the clear energy pathway. It was Thomas Grayling, recognizable from photographs, but somehow both older and younger simultaneously, his face bearing the weathered experience of 4 decades, but his body appearing as it had in. He began to ascend the staircase slowly, deliberately, each step seeming to require immense effort. Behind him, a second figure appeared, Ethan Miller, followed one by the 9 scouts, each emerging from the chamber below and beginning the long climb toward the surface. As they ascended, something strange became apparent to the observers. With each step, the figures changed, aging rapidly before their eyes. Grayling's hair grayed and then whitened, his posture stooping slightly. The scouts grew taller, their faces maturing from adolescence to adulthood and beyond. They were experiencing 40 years of aging compressed into the minutes of their ascent. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern horizon, 11 figures stood at the top of the light staircase, poised at the threshold between the water and the air. 11 men in their 50s and 60s, wearing scout uniforms that had aged with them, weathered and faded, but still recognizable. Thomas Grayling, now an elderly man with eyes that held decades of unimaginable experience, was the first to step onto the shore. As his foot touched solid ground, the pathway behind him flickered, and a shadow seemed to pass through it, something formless and dark attempting to follow him through the portal. Military personnel raised their weapons, but Grayling turned back toward the pathway and raised his hand in a gesture of denial. "You cannot pass," he said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed more than human. "The bargain is complete. The door is closing." Behind him, the other members of Troop 47 stepped onto shore one by one, each turning to face the portal as they did. As the last scout, Benjamin Hayes, now a man in his early 50s, reached solid ground, all 11 formed a circle facing the light pathway, joined hands and began to speak in unison, in a language no one present had ever heard before. The shadow within the pathway writhed and pulsed, stretching toward the shore, but unable to cross the final threshold. The light began to contract, narrowing from a staircase to a thin column, and finally to a mere thread connecting the lake's surface to the stars above. With a sound like crystal shattering, it vanished entirely, leaving the pre-dawn darkness and the gentle lapping of normal lake water against the shore. In the underwater chamber below, monitoring equipment recorded a final surge of energy before the mercury core solidified completely, transforming from liquid to a solid metallic plug that sealed whatever passage had existed there. The carved message changed one final time, now reading simply, "The door is closed." On the shore, the 11 returned members of Troop 47 collapsed simultaneously, their bodies finally reacting to the trauma of transition and accelerated aging. Medical teams rushed forward, confirming that all were alive, but in varying states of physical distress. As they were transported to a specially prepared medical facility, questions already began to form about what would happen next. How would these men, who had left as boys in 1985, reintegrate into a world that had moved on without them? How would they explain their absence to a public that could never know the full truth? And what knowledge had they brought back from 4 decades in another reality? In the days that followed, as the returned scouts stabilized and began to share their experiences, one thing became clear. They were profoundly changed by their time on the other side. Each possessed knowledge and abilities that defied conventional explanation, from languages they couldn't possibly have learned to scientific insights beyond current human understanding. More concerning to the authorities was the deep connection they maintained with each other, a form of silent communication that allowed them to coordinate without speaking and share information instantaneously across distances. Though they insisted this ability was a defensive adaptation that had helped them resist assimilation by the entities, it raised questions about whether they had returned entirely human. Extensive testing revealed subtle alterations in their DNA changes that were neither harmful nor immediately concerning, but undeniably alien to human genetics. Their cells showed remarkable regenerative properties, and their brain activity patterns were unlike anything previously recorded in medical literature. When asked if they had brought back any influence from the beings that had imprisoned them, Thomas Grayling, who had emerged as their de facto spokesperson, gave an answer that was both reassuring and troubling. "We contain nothing of them within us, but we understand them now, their nature, their intentions, their weaknesses. We know what they want and why they want it, and we know they'll try again, through another door, in another 40 years. The debriefing of Troop 47 continued for months, yielding insights into phenomena that had been previously dismissed as pseudoscience or fantasy. They spoke of parallel realities existing alongside our own, separated by barriers that thinned at certain points in space and time. They described entities that existed beyond conventional matter, beings of pure consciousness that had evolved in ways fundamentally different from life on Earth. Most significantly, they warned that what had happened at Lake Midnight was not an isolated incident. There were other thin places around the world, other potential doorways that could be opened during the right celestial alignments. The entities that had trapped them were part of a larger presence that had been attempting to access our reality for millennia, patiently waiting for the right conditions and the right human collaborators. For the families of the returned, the joy of reunion was complicated by the knowledge that the men who had come back were not the boys who had left. Decades of experience in an alien reality had shaped them into something both more and less than human beings, who looked like their lost loved ones, but whose minds had been expanded beyond normal human limits. The town of Pinehaven, after the initial shock and celebration, settled into an uneasy new normal. The returned scouts, after months of debriefing and rehabilitation, were gradually reintegrated into society, with carefully constructed cover stories about an experimental program gone wrong and decades spent in specialized care. Some families accepted this narrative publicly, while privately acknowledging the more fantastic truth. Others chose to embrace the official explanation entirely, finding it easier to believe than the alternative. Lake Midnight itself was permanently closed to the public, the entire area designated a restricted research zone under joint scientific and military oversight. The underwater chamber was sealed with concrete, the mercury core extracted and stored in a secure facility for study. Monitoring equipment remained in place throughout the lake, designed to detect any recurrence of the anomalous phenomena that had allowed the portal to open. As for the returned members of Troop 47, they formed a close-knit community on the outskirts of Pinehaven, living together in a compound that local residents referred to simply as the camp. Though they participated in town events and maintained relationships with their families, they remained apart in subtle ways, observers rather than full participants in the human society they had rejoined. In private conversations with Dr. Hartwick, who continued to work with them long after the official project had been classified and compartmentalized, Thomas Grayling spoke of a mission that had only just begun. "We didn't just come back to escape," he explained during one recorded session. "We came back to prepare. What's out there, what almost came through with us, hasn't given up. It's patient, and it has other doors to try. We need to be ready when it finds one that opens." When asked if he regretted leading the Scouts into another reality 40 years earlier, Grayling's answer was surprisingly candid. "Every day and not at all. We lost our lives as they should have been. But we gained understanding no human was ever meant to have. We became something new, not entirely human anymore, but perhaps what humans might evolve into given enough time. We are the advanced Scouts for what humanity could become." He paused, looking out the window toward Lake Midnight, its surface now placid and ordinary in the afternoon sun. "The real question," he continued, "is whether the world is ready for what we know. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. Not just the physical ones between realities, but the doors of perception, of understanding. We have seen behind the veil, Dr. Hartwick, and now so have you." As winter settled over Pinehaven once more, the 11 returned members of Troop 47 gathered at the memorial stone that had stood for decades by the lake's edge. In a private ceremony attended only by their closest family members, they placed 11 new candles among the stone figures, lighting them one by one as dusk fell. The stone had been modified with a simple addition, a brass plaque that read, "Lost July 17, 1985. Found November 17, 2025. Some journeys take us further than we ever intended to go." As the last candle was lit, those present reported seeing a brief shimmer over the lake's surface, a momentary reflection of the Pleiades in the darkening water, stars that should not have been visible at that angle or that time of evening. The 11 men stood at attention, gave a perfect Scout salute to the lake, then turned as one and walked back toward town, leaving the memorial and its flickering lights behind. The door had closed, but the journey for Troop 47 and perhaps for humanity itself was far from over.